Good morning, everyone. Eid Mubarak, Navroz Mubarak, and a very, very happy International World Poetry Day. This is Smita Sahai. I am the founder and editor-in-chief of Usawa Literary Review and Matchbox by Usawa. Among, the reasons such as the festivals, we are also extremely happy today to be sharing with you our inaugural lecture for the Usawa Study Circle. I will tell you a little bit about the Usawa Study Circle. It is we are based in India. We are based in Mumbai, headquartered in Mumbai. We are online, entirely self-funded, independent, feminist literary organization. We are dedicated to showcasing feminist-oriented literature. And with this lecture series, we hope to invite as many people as possible into this online space to foster deeper engagement with and critique of hegemonic discourses and mediate the different dimensions of subjecthood in Indian and international socio-political milieus. The idea is that in our study circles, people even outside the academic space, even outside the literary space, have access to a community uh, and a stellar community of educators, practitioners, journalists, artists, who can take us through the different facets of what does it mean to have a feminist discourse, a feminist discussion. Um, Today, we are extremely thrilled to have with us Urmi Bhattacharya. First, I want to tell you why this means a lot to me personally and to Usawa. With every self-funded organization, especially, that has just one person at the top, uh, which had become at that time me, there are always these moments of self-doubt which basically make us question the entire reason for doing something, which at that time seems monumental, difficult to pull off. And 2021 was one such time for me, for Usawa. And I didn't know whether I had it in me to carry on. And it was at such a time when Urmi's email had come in, her book had come out. The book was titled After I Was Raped, and it was a very simple, inquiry for a book review. And the moment I saw the title of the book and the description of the book, there was just this re, sort of, yeah, it was a reaffirmation of what we had set out to do, why we had set out to build Usawa. And even if it seemed difficult in that moment to carry on, the point was that it was important to carry on. So, Urmi, you and the book have been instrumental in keeping Usawa alive through the self-doubt, through the tribulations that anyone goes through. It's not something that is particular to me or to our organization. I think anybody goes through this. So, and thank you so much for agreeing to do this maiden lecture. Urmi Bhattacharya is a freelance journalist in India, primarily reporting stories of sexual violence against women and children and health and social justice. She is also the author of the book After I Was Raped, published by Pan Macmillan, that charts the aftermath of long-running rape cases in court in the lives of 5 survivors in India. The book was long-listed at Tata Literature Live and shortlisted for Best Debut, Times of India Author Awards. She is also a recipient of the UN Ladli Award for Gender-Sensitive Reporting and was the gender editor at The Quint. Her stories have been published in the Boston Globe, Women's Media Center, Globe, and Mail, Mike, Unicorn Riot, The Caravan, among others. Currently, Urmi researches the phenomenon of marital rape and the articulations of consent across India, a country that does not yet criminalize marital rape. Find her on Twitter or X at Urmi_1990 and on Instagram at Urmi Tells Stories and at Urmi6. I'll also take this opportunity to introduce to you the host of this lecture series, Ankush Banerjee, who is also our book reviews editor. Ankush is a poet, research scholar, and educator. He is the author of 2 volumes of poetry, The Essence of Eternity and Field Notes of Kindness. He is a masculinity studies research scholar, a reviews editor at Osawa, and a serving officer and educator in the Indian Navy. For him, poetry has been a lifelong preoccupation that has grown quietly alongside uniforms, classrooms, research, and the daily practice of responsibility that deepens rather than limits. Over to you, Ankush and Urmi. Um, thank you again for doing this.
Thank you so much, Smita, and thank you so much, Urmi. Good morning, everyone. It is an honor and a very onerous responsibility to open a discussion on After I Was Raped by Urmi Bhattacharya. It's a work that asks us to confront not only the event of sexual violence, but also the long, unending aftermath that it entails. Before we proceed, I will just lay out the broad plan for the session. After I introduce the book, I will call upon Urmi to speak about the book and also her current work, current research. Various links to relevant books, including Urmi's and some of the reviews, will also be shared on the comment section. Audiences can leave their comments and questions in the comment sections, which I will be monitoring. Once Urmi finishes, we will start with questions from the comment section and then move on to audience questions. The idea is to make the session as interactive as possible. I will end by emphasizing some of the key points made by Urmi and thanking her, and then we shall close the session. At the outset, when we speak of sexual violence within the feminist scholarship, sexual violence is not merely seen as an act, but as a structure and as a structural manifestation. Susan Brownmiller, one of the foremost theoreticians in the field, famously described rape as, and I quote, a conscious process of intimidation, while Judith Herman foregrounds its enduring psychological consequences, which is trauma, fragmentation, and the slow, uneven work of recovery. In the Indian context, we have scholars like Flavia Agnes and Nivedita Menon who have shown how sexual violence is entangled with very complex intersectional axis of identities such as caste, class, and patriarchy, shaping not only who is vulnerable, but also how justice is often pursued and often denied. More importantly, sexual violence is never experienced in isolation. Survivors often encounter stigma, victim blaming, and institutional apathy, while caregivers, that is, parents, partners, families, navigate their own forms of trauma, confusion, and social pressure. Something that we see being shown and also interrogated in Urmi's book. As Urmi's work underscores, the after of rape is lived in courtrooms, in homes, in everyday negotiations of fear, memory, and survival. Survivors are often shamed, ostracized and weighed down by guilt and depression, as one of the uh, reviews from the Times of India mentions. Also, caregivers oscillate between protection, disbelief, and helplessness, as we again saw in some of the interviews which she took in the book. It is here that After I Rape becomes very profoundly important because, unlike sensational media narratives that focus on the moment of violence, Urmi's book begins where public attention ends, that is, tracing the lives of these 5 survivors across years of legal delays, social stigma, and emotional upheaval. In my understanding, the book exposes the tensions and also the emotional costs which arise between collective amnesia, that is the societal tendency to forget and move on, and the individual struggles and the exhaustion which leaves survivors to endure the slow violence of aftermath alone. The book covers in-depth interviews with 5 rape survivors and from very diverse social and economic backgrounds, their families, and various support mechanisms or lack thereof, which shape or preclude their struggles for justice. Uh, in doing so, Urmi's book enters into conversations with works like Sohela Abdullali's What We Talk About When We Talk About Rape, who's also blurbed for the book. Uh, and also Brownmiller's Against Our Will. And yet it contributes something distinct, I would say. I argue that it offers an ethnographic, deeply situated Indian account foregrounding caste-based sexual violence, the failures of the legal system, and certain intimate geographies of trauma where survivors often continue to live alongside perpetrators. Again, as we see in two of the very, very gut-wrenching chapters of the book. Anubha Bhosle, the author of Mother, Where is My Country, says of the book, and I quote, it's a vital documentation that shows a mirror to every stakeholder in the criminal justice system. While our own editor-in-chief, Smita Sahai, in a review in Usawa, writes, and I quote, the book is written with a journalist's precision, a storyteller's brilliance, and a survivor's empathy. Bhattacharya's love and admiration for the survivor's courage is palpable on every page. But this is where Smita asks, but why is this courage necessary? This courage to stand before a system that looks you in the eye and not only fails you, but blames you over and over to say, I was violated, I want justice. Unquote. Ultimately, the book is not just documentation, it's a very profound moral and ethical intervention. And speaking about it today at Usawa is Usawa's way of participating in expressing solidarity with and building upon such an intervention. The book compels us as readers, researchers, scholars, and citizens to rethink justice beyond verdicts and to center care alongside law and to listen with humility to voices that persist long after headlines have faded. So thank you so much, Smita, for conceptualizing this and to Urmi for consenting to be part of this. The links to all the reference material will be shared in the comment section subsequently. Please feel free to leave your comments and questions, which we will return to after Urmi's talk. So without further ado, I hand over the reins of the session to Urmi to take forward with her talk. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ankush. I think that was a beautiful encapsulation of my book. I don't think I could have said it any better. And I want to steal that for all future discussions of my book and kind of front it with that. So thank you for kind of, understanding just the verve of the book and what I meant to do. And also thank you, Smita. I didn't know that, I had that sort of almost personal, intimate impact on the trajectory of Usawa and how it stands today. And I don't want to take that credit because I think what Usawa is doing is seminal. So I'm really glad that you are at the helm of this and that Ankush is doing what he is. I think study circles like this are so important because one of the reasons even I wrote the book was because I didn't see much of this. I didn't see much of this conversation. I didn't really see anything about the aftermath. So the fact that we even continue to have these conversations a few years after the book even just tells me that it's not going to die out. So that just gives me a lot of hope. So thank you, both of you, and thank you to everybody who's here today. I can't see everybody, but I know that we are virtually here, and in this post-COVID world, it's one of the best ways to be together. So thank you. Let me start by sharing my screen with you all, and if you can't see it, please let me know. Is this visible to everybody? Ankush, can you see my screen?
Yes, it's visible. It's visible.
Okay, perfect. Okay, great. I just wanted to, like Ankush said, I want to make this as interactive as possible. So if there's anywhere that, anybody has a question or just wants to kind of pop in, please feel free to, leave that in the comments. I'll leave that in the chat box. I'll get back to you. And I'm basically just kind of, giving you something to look at, if you will, just like a series of slides on not just the book, but also my motivations, how I came to this, why I started writing this, why I thought that I would be able to write this, because like Smita said, sometimes one is besieged with self-doubt and you wonder, can I even write this? So this is sort of the journey of where that began. Ankush and Smita have already sort of given you a bit of an introduction of where I come from, but this is a slide to sort of tell you what I've done before this. I come from an English lit background. I didn't know I was going to be a journalist. I just always knew I wanted to write. And then eventually, when I started working at the Quint, now over 10 years ago, maybe 12 years ago, I digital media was coming about. I was shifting about between beats, as we call it in journalism. I was figuring things out. And very quickly, I realized what my beat was and that it was going to be gender and primarily gender violence, sexual violence. So when I began to oversee the gender tone of the outlet, I began to see what wasn't happening yet in Indian media. The fact that, mediatized narratives at the time of sexual violence were very problematic. They still are a little bit, actually. When I was researching, my slides for this work, I was kind of looking at recent headlines, and we still use headlines that are very passive to the victim or the survivor. We still use imagery. I don't know, you've probably seen it, but the kind of image where it's a girl's face, tears running down her eyes with her hands up. And that, for some reason, is just the stock image that we use for rape, and we continue to. So I began to kind of just, sort of envision that I might be able to, kind of take that on and do that perhaps with my own stories. So I began with writing a lot of investigative pieces because we were a new digital outlet. I also began to kind of produce podcasts. So, one would just be sent out with a phone and you audio record it. And eventually, when we got a little more money, you got a little more equipment, and you basically began to record people's voices. You took a phone around, a smartphone, that it's one of the best things we have. So if you don't have a large camera, I would just take my phone around. I would record people who wanted to speak about what had happened. And so I began to, tell a lot of sexual violence stories, and other journalists were also doing that. But after a point, what began to happen was that I realized one would cover something and then people would forget. So you would report on something that's happened, let's say in Patparganj, Delhi, right? Because Delhi was where I was doing my work. And then 2 weeks later, I would wonder, what happened to that story? Did the FIR get filed? Did it reach courts? And so perhaps there would be another follow-up. I would do a second follow-up, someone else would. But then once again, the story would kind of peter out. And I began to realize months on, 6 months on, a year on, that there was a lot that even I didn't know, that we often forgot to kind of stay with the story and to see what was happening after. So eventually, when I began to, kind of develop these rapport, and I think when you do work like this, it's inevitable that you become friends with a lot of the survivors that you report on, with a lot of the families, because you're in these really intimate, close spaces, geographies. You're being told a lot of stories with a lot of confidence, so you follow up. And as I began to follow up, I just realized that there was a lot we didn't know. After it reached the police station, there were many stories of how there would be pressure or coercion on a family to take a case back. Or if it did reach courts, the idea that, often in a lot of these stories, if they came from marginalized backgrounds, they would often share spaces with the assailant. And so the assailant's family would be, sort of exerting a lot of coercion on them to take a case back. So what happened after that? And if they did take a case back, you'll see this sort of touted a lot in MRA narratives, men's right activist narratives, which they have, sure, there's some intrinsic value to the fact that one doesn't front male abuse stories, but the fact is what they really try to highlight is the idea that there are fake narratives, that there are blown up statistics of the fact that there are fake cases. What that doesn't account for is that a lot of these cases are forcibly kind of taken back. And I saw that a lot in my story, in my trajectory, which was one of the reasons that I thought the aftermath was important to kind of stay with. So I was at the Quint for 5 years, doing a lot of this follow-ups. But in 2020, right before the pandemic, was when I left. I decided to become an independent journalist. That was also when I started to write my book. And the reason I began to write the book is because I was doing these stories already, and I just felt like a book would be the perfect encapsulation of this work, to take 5 stories, stories that weren't necessarily voyeuristic, as we had seen in the media, stories that weren't necessarily prominent in any way that we think of when we think of rape, but that they were prominent because they existed, and I wanted to show what happens, basically follow the questions that I had been asking myself. What happens a month after, a year after? Some of these stories at that time had already been 5 years on from their case. Some of the assailants had been acquitted. So I wanted to sort of pick stories that you wouldn't really think of fronting when you write a sexual violence book. So I wrote that, and like Ankush said, Smita said, it was fortunate enough to kind of get some attention at the time. It made a few long lists and short lists, etc. And sometimes when one speaks of sexual violence, one speaks of the book because I believe perhaps there hadn't been a lot of narratives that did this aftermath work. So that's where I began my work. And what that book also takes you to is to think about loopholes that still exist. For me, that loophole began to exist in narratives of marital rape, where a law does not exist. India doesn't have a marital rape law. For some bizarre reason, one can, as a wife, you could be raped in this country and not get justice. So that is my current work. But to take you through a bit of the book and also perhaps certain things that might interest you. These are, so if you can see my slide, these are three stories that I believe kind of highlight, before I even talk about the book, that highlight cases of rape and how they sort of exist in India. And they're three very disparate stories. But you'll see that there's a common link between them. And I'll open it up to you, at the end of this. You can tell me what stays with you in the story. So the first one, and this is the headline that the Quint ran with when I did this story in 2018. I'll tell you the story. There was a woman who was 19 years old, came from, a dominant caste family in a village in Rewari, Haryana, several kilometers from Delhi. And she used to go to a tuition class that was a few bus stops away from her village. She was one of the women in her family who'd been encouraged to be educated when nobody else could. So she was the pride of her family in some sense. And she'd been harassed and stalked by a group of men. Nishu was one of the men who was sort of at the helm of this for a while, but nobody had taken this seriously until one day when Nishu and a group of men abducted her at the bus stop while she was waiting for her bus to take her to the tuition class, had dragged her to a pump room or a tube well room and basically gang raped her, which, is one of the vilest things that happen in the subcontinent, where raping a woman is essentially a sport and you can take it in turns to sort of exert this bizarre sort of violence. And so after the gang rape, the story made a lot of headlines. Journalists from Delhi, because we were close by, we were all going in there, reporting the story. I did too. I did a few follow-ups, and one of the things that emerged a lot in my interviews with the family, the mother would tell me, is that why did nobody ever stop Nishu when this was happening? I mean, he had been molesting my daughter for a while, he'd been stalking her, but somehow no one took us seriously. She'd been telling us, and for some reason, Nishu had always had a bad reputation. So that was one of the most interesting things that began to come up in our conversation a lot. She was like, everyone kind of knew. It wasn't unknown to anybody. It wasn't even surprising when my daughter accused Nishu and his group of friends of gang raping her. But somehow there had been no steps or hurdles to his eventually taking this step. So when she told me that, I began to, sort of walk around in the village. I was treated with a lot of mistrust in the village. Lots of people, asked me what my caste was, what my class was. There were a lot of these bearings that were very important in that specific social milieu. I got out of that as best as possible, but I really wanted to find out what I thought was the crux of the story, that what happens when you have a case or an escalation like this, and there are multiple steps leading up to that, but nobody has kind of stepped in. So at the time, like I told you, the case made headlines. So an SIT, which is a special investigative team that is often formed in India when, something becomes really major. And so, an external police team is formed to investigate the case, and they don't necessarily have to be within the same jurisdiction of the village, but they take charge of the case. So the IPS officer who was in charge of the SIT, I was in conversation with her, and she told me as well when I was talking to her that, one of the things that could really strengthen this case is if we knew Nishu's past history, like what caused this. And I feel like we're missing that because the village doesn't trust us. The village didn't trust me either. So I understood where she was coming from. And she was like, we simply need to kind of cement this aspect. So I went back to the village multiple times. I would walk around, and there was one day when I just decided I would go with a ruse and I would pretend, I would tell people that I already knew that, I knew of somebody that Nishu had stalked When you report sexual violence for a while, you begin to recognize these patterns as well. And I acted on the assumption that, yes, these things don't happen in isolation. There would have been a pattern where Nishu would have stalked someone and it didn't get reported. So the boy was emboldened. There would have been a time when he harassed someone, it didn't get reported, and he was emboldened. Eventually, it leads to a story like this or a case like this. So I began to walk around the village, pretending or sort of, fronting the fact that perhaps I knew of cases when Ishu had done this before, and, could someone point me to someone who'd be willing to speak? Eventually there was a woman who approached me and who said that, I know who you're talking about, and let me take you to the outskirts of the village. And somewhere almost poetically, almost at the periphery of where the village ended, near a field, there was a family and a woman with children, and I went and sort of approached her, and she told me that, I know why you're here. I know that you're reporting on the story of the Rewari gang rape survivor, and I'd like to tell you that I'm glad you're doing this because nobody heard me when I wanted to tell my story. So that sort of came as a bit of a shock to me, because even though I was hoping to find somebody who would cement the fact that Nishu's pattern was an isolated, I didn't expect to have somebody tell me that actually I did try to speak up and nobody heard me then. So she told me about a year ago, she'd been in the fields, and to spare you the details, it'll be in a lot of stories now. Nishu had attempted to rape her as well. She'd gotten away. She tried to tell other people in the village, but it had sort of been stifled at a Khap Panchayat level, where they'd said, let him apologize to you and we let him get away with it. He came from some privilege. And so nothing was done. It wasn't reported. And as the SIT had assumed, as a lot of gender theorizing will also tell you, it did cause a pattern of emboldenment, which ultimately led to Nishu sort of carrying out the gang rape, which became that big. So eventually, when this woman whom I had found told me that she was willing to speak about this, that she wanted to report her case, the SIT was called. I was present, and she told her story, her year-old story, to the police, and that actually ended up sort of strengthening the story to immense levels. It is one of the rare cases where Nishu actually he did get convicted, he and his group of people, because there was enough evidence against them, with the Rewari gang rape survivor speaking up, with this woman, this mother of two kids, speaking up about her year-old story. Lots of other women came forward, and the case was, sort of watertight. So that was a watershed moment for me, for realizing what gender violence begins to look like, that it doesn't exist in isolation. There are social machinations that are far beyond our imaginations before we actually enter that milieu. So that is one story that I found out. The second one, and this exists in my book as well, is the story of an 8-month-old rape survivor. Many people who've read my book have told me that this is the one that they choose to skip, or they want to skip when they see that it's a baby. And I often put people at ease by telling them that I'm still in touch with the baby, and she's about to be 9 years old, and she's incredible and vibrant and sassy and all of those things, but she's had a terrible thing happen to her, and her parents are as resilient as possible. But this story told me a lot. It told me about the intimate geographies within which rape in India often exist. When I went to, we called at the Quint, when I was reporting this story, when I first began to, we, in the media, good or bad, like to give monikers to stories, just so you can keep kind of putting them in headlines, right, for SEO. And so the name that my editors came up with for this story, for this baby, was Chutki, which, is Hindi for just a small kid, a small infant. And so Chutki was an 8-month-old baby at the time that she was raped by her much older cousin. Her parents were, her father was a daily wage laborer. Her mother was a domestic help. They worked in houses nearby, and they always left their two children, this 8-month-old baby and her older sibling, 2 years older than her, at home with their other relatives. And if you live in a joint family, or if you've seen that around you, still very common in India, you essentially have a house with different stories where, your father's brothers, because it's still a patriarchal, patrilineal family. So you'll have your father's family kind of inhabiting different floors of the same house, and that was their case. So they would leave their two kids behind with the cousins and the uncle and aunts of the family, and they would leave for work. And one particular morning, when they came back, the mother came back, she found that her baby had been raped. She was lying in a pool of blood and stool, and she saw the cousin acting shiftily around her. She instinctively accused him. And of course, eventually in police investigation, it was, police investigation sort of pinned it on him. And so he's been in custody since, and their case has still been dragging on. So it has been, this happened in 2018. We're now in 2026. 8 years later, this is one of the cases that after Nirbhaya, the Indian government sort of constituted a lot of amendments. And cases like this were supposed to be fast track cases. So fast track courts had been set up where you could try these cases and justice would be very swift, intervention would be speedy. But this case tells you otherwise. It hasn't happened. I'm here to tell you the unfortunate fact that even in a fast track case where this got a lot of attention, actually, the DCW, the Delhi Commission for Women, were on the streets. Media stayed with this case for a really long time, not anymore perhaps, but we're 8 years on and no justice has happened. And the unfortunate part of this is they still live in that small 8 by 8 sort of space that they inhabited where their baby was raped 8 years ago. The four of them still sleep in the same bed. The cousins, the uncles and aunts who were in the house that day, who refused to acknowledge anything had happened, still inhabit the same geography. Every few months or so, I get a call from the child's mother who tells me that we would like to move out, Didi. Do you know of houses? Can you help us with a broker? I personally have gone on multiple house visits with them where we begin to explore places, neighborhoods. Sometimes they tell me they want to change cities, but eventually, after a while, they'll tell me, no, we can't leave. We feel tied to and sort of almost trapped in this space where the crime happened, and we cannot leave until he's been punished. We cannot leave until we feel like some semblance of justice has happened within this geography. So that tells you a lot about how one small sort of space becomes a microcosm of a much larger unit or a much larger social milieu. And the third story that I wanted to tell you about, this is the last chapter in my book. So there are 5 stories in my book. I don't presume you've all read my book, but of the 5 stories, they're all basically named after the woman or the pseudonym that I've given the survivor. This is the one that personally stays with me a lot because it's almost a relentless, endless cycle of exile, familial exile. None of the others face this to the point that Smita, which is what I call her, faces, and the level of guilt and resignation that she has sort of exerted on herself. So when I first met her, she had been raped by her partner. And she was determined to see that case through. She had filed an FIR. Her case had begun. But she got a lot of blame from her parents, who told her that they didn't believe that she had been raped. They believed that she, had premarital relations with somebody that they had not approved of. And so they disbelieved her, but she decided to continue and take the case to court. 2 years ago, when I met her again, she told me that she had taken her case back, retracted her police complaint, as a result of which her accused was acquitted. She said that she did that because she was lonely. She didn't know what else to do. She had no support. After that, her parents married her off to someone, and this is the part that is always hard for me to even fathom. She's been married off to somebody and is currently subjected to marital rape at the hands of that very husband who she's been arranged married to. And when she tells her parents this, they tell her that, this is something that's happened to you before. It's happened to you again. We can't take you back. We married you off because we thought that, you'd be better off. You'd already been raped. And so, we thought perhaps you'd be out of this space, out of this milieu. It's happened to you again. Well, you can't come back here. So she is in a unique space of sort of social exclusion or ostracism where she can't go back home. She can't stay at home, her current marital home, which is supposed to be where she's resigned to. Cops won't take her statement because marital rape as a crime does not exist in India. You can get a civil statute filed, there are, sort of statutes that exist for that, but nothing under our criminal amendment law. So she can't do that. At best, she can, take the help of an NGO or a shelter and move out and stay elsewhere. But the idea is that through this endless pattern and cycle of abuse that has happened with her, the biggest thing that she's missing, that has not been missing in a lot of the other cases, is that she does not have that support system, and therefore she blames herself a lot. And she looks at, in multiple sort of conversations with her interviews, and she's somebody who, similar to the others, also really wants to tell her story. So she tells me every time she wants something out there, or she wants people to know, audiences to know, or readers, however she feels like it could get out there. She always tells me, what am I supposed to do? Because I feel like my body has now become a site where people keep score, and I don't even look at it as my own. So hers is a very unique case of social exile that I feel like perhaps doesn't exist for the others, and almost in some sense feels suffocating because it's endless. So these are the three stories I wanted to highlight. If you look at the book, they're not all there, but they're kind of impressions that have stayed with me and that still influence my reporting. So when after I was raped, like I told you, there are 5 stories there. So one is Nidhi. Nidhi is actually the one on the left with the 2 pigtails and the camouflage bag. This is part of a documentary that I had done. So Nidhi is the first story in the book. The Quint called her Choti Nirbhaya at the time that I was still with them, because the circumstances of the rape were very similar. Voyeuristic descriptions of how the violence was enacted. The second and third stories are the stories of 2 Dalit women in Madhya Pradesh, extremely brave because they stood up to a lot of village pressure, a lot of dominant caste pressure in their villages to retract their case. And they stood up to that. And even though in both cases the accused have been acquitted, I argue in the book that one of the prime reasons that that happened is because both these women were subjected to something that should have been banned, and in fact was in law banned, but police examinations were still carrying them out sporadically, which was the 2 finger test, which, if you don't know what it is a pseudo medical examination that used to be carried out once upon a time, and by rights shouldn't be, where 2 fingers are sort of inserted into a woman's genitals to check the laxity of her inner parts, and to kind of determine that she was habituated to sex and therefore could not have been raped. So it is possibly the most bizarre kind of machination that you will hear in a rape investigation, but it used to happen. So both these women were subjected to that. They were married women, and somehow it was held against them. The fourth case, of course, was that of Pia's. Pia is what I call, Chutki, who was the 8-month-old baby. And finally, Smita's story, which I've already told you, she just lives with an inability to forgive herself. So that is just the crux of the story, the crux of the book, very simple, just 5 chapters, tells you what there is to know about what could happen. And then, so my interventions personally, as I come to the end of my reporting journey, or my, talking about this book, some of the things that I have learned to do has been, I began as just a reporter. I would be sent out there with a notebook or a phone or a camera, and eventually I began to traverse those boundaries, but it kind of happened organically. So I traversed the boundaries between reporting or documenting to starting to listen, and to listen obviously from a position of privilege or access, right? Because that's where I come from. And so when you occupy that space, you begin to realize the huge sort of responsibility that is on you. And when you listen with that sort of sense of access, you begin to kind of realize how that doesn't exist for the other party. So in a lot of my cases that I reported, some of them came from a lot of privilege. But something that was very common in a lot of these stories, and that is a lack in our Indian justice system, is that at many points there is a wall that exists between the survivor wanting to do something and the system helping them out. So in a lot of cases, in Choti Nirbhaya's case, in Chutki's case, they came from families that could not read English. India's official court language is English, so court transcripts are in English. In case you didn't know, medical documents, of course, are in English, but a doctor, if they have the patience, will explain it to you in Hindi or Gujarati or Telugu, however you understand that. But in a lot of these cases of survivors' families who don't come from any sort of privilege, that explanation is not offered. So many times when I went to follow-ups, one of my prime jobs would be above reporting to translate things. So I would be given sheets of court documents. I would be asked, Didi, we don't know how the hearing's going. Do you have any idea? Could you help? So it was me making a lot of phone calls on their behalf and trying to understand, trying to figure out things. I mean, I hadn't filed the case myself, right? But I had to do a lot of this navigating and traversing of spaces to find out something that they possibly couldn't. For instance, in Chutki's case, when I was at the Quint, we had set up a crowdfunding campaign for them, and people had been so overwhelmed by her story. She was a baby, everyone cared. So there was a lot of funds that had come in for her, and we set up a bank account for them. But even a year later, they would tell me, Didi, how do we access this bank account? Could you come with us? Like, who do we speak to? So I think in a lot of these cases, we don't realize that the social afterlife of violence like this exists in these little lagging paths, in these paths where you don't know who to speak to find out how your hearing's gone. In many cases, when they do want to show up to their own court hearings, they'll be told, don't worry, we'll let you know. We'll let you know, if the case is getting to an acquittal or a conviction, but they often don't know when that's going to happen. So for me, a lot of this reporting, a lot of this book writing has come from a standpoint of rapport, of friendship. I think that has naturally existed because you begin to see these questions that aren't asked in the media. What that sort of violence does to your love life, to your sex life, to your familial life, how you sort of traverse your public space. For a long time after Smita's rape, she couldn't take a specific metro from point A to point B, on Delhi's Blue Line, because that was where she'd meet the former partner who'd raped her. So just aspects like that you don't really think about, but that kind of influence your everyday. For instance, in Chutki's case, the idea that you're within that space where the baby was raped, and the parents are like, everybody here is talking about it. But our challenge is to make sure that our now 9-year-old child doesn't know what happened to her when she was a baby. And I asked them, how are you doing that? And they're like, she's very curious. She tries to listen. She eavesdrops. Obviously, she's a little girl. She's curious. And we change the subject. We try to talk about something else. We take phone calls elsewhere, but our sole goal is to not tell her. And yet it is one of the most difficult things because we're confined to that space still. So, the question that I ask is how one could occupy that space where you're still a reporter, obviously, right? If you're reporting this, or if you come from, an academic background, I was for a short time, and you want to, write an ethnography. The idea is obviously you still have a responsibility to whoever you're writing for. There are certain things you want to highlight, what could change in the justice system. You're thinking about media, a medium that you're using. All of that is important because there is value to how that story is being told. So you do focus on that, but at the same time, when you have that kind of rapport, you understand what needs to be magnified, what needs to be amplified, and that might not be what you're already seeing. That might not be, the voyeuristic aspects that exist. It could be elsewhere. Yeah. And so these have been basically my reporting pivots. My attempt has been to witness, my attempt has been to follow up, my attempt has been to change this imagery of shame and of violence and to hold these sort of systems accountable, whether it's the policing system or the judiciary, whether it's the idea that a law doesn't exist, or if a law exists, it's not accessible to a large tranche of people, and where the loopholes exist, which is why my current focus is on marital rape, because that came up a lot in my reporting and that I realized was not being addressed. Thank you. I think that is as succinctly as I could perhaps sum up the trajectory of where I've taken my sexual violence reporting, and perhaps some of that will stay with you, that there is a lot more to know and there is a lot more to learn.
Uh, I think I can, yeah. Thank you so much, Urmi. That was very, very insightful. If we can just start with some of the questions which sort of came up. Uh, in your book, uh, I was very curious when I came across this public prosecutor called Raj Kataria. Uh,
Right.
because she was also like there is a lot of about her, about how she's very she understands where
Mhm.
the victims are coming from. She understands where these complaints are coming from, and her position is sort of, I think there is one. Oh, I think I'll come to my question later. We'll
Okay.
come to Gitika Rao, and who
Yeah.
said you kind of answered some part of it. But while writing the book and telling the stories of survivors of sexual violence, how did you see your role as a writer? Was it purely journalistic voice, or did the process require a more personal and ethically involved position? So this is what Gitika Rao has asked us.
Yeah.
So if you could just
Yeah. Thanks for your question, Geetika. A very important question. It's something that I asked myself constantly while I was writing it. I think when I reported the stories before I began to write the book, I did it journalistically because I thought it was important, because I just wanted to highlight the story. It needed to be out there. Some of the stories were not getting attention. When I chose to write the book, like actually begin the process of putting pen to paper, I realized that it needed a lot more kind of intrinsic involvement that went beyond what you as a journalist or an academic or even an interested party could possibly do, because it sort of elicited a very long-term relationship, and that when you develop something like that, that necessitates a kind of rapport that couldn't exist as just a journalist or just a documentarian. So that's one of the reasons why I think we're at about 4 years beyond the time that I published the book and it's been out there, but I'm still in touch with every single one of them because none of their stories sadly have ended. Even in the cases where acquittals have happened, they're in the process of appeals. In the case of Chutki, like I mentioned, they are looking to move out, they can't move out. There is a sense of them being pressured by family and wanting to kind of change situations, change surroundings. So I think, it went beyond the role of just a journalist to a role of almost a confidant. So a lot of times, how I now write about them depends a lot on what they tell me. And they sort of hold the reins to that. So sometimes they will call me and let me know that, Didi, this is the current hurdle that we're facing. We don't know where this situation is at, or we don't know how to access the money, or this is the hurdle, which perhaps you or I, even as an interested party or as a journalist, might not know exists as a hurdle. So I think a lot of my writing kind of now depends on what comes to me. And that is where the sense of discovery takes over.
thanks for the great presentation, very insightful. Could you share a bit about the psychological impact on survivors and families? That is 1 month, 1 year thereafter. How would you say your presence played a role? And what kind of psychosocial support would you say exists for survivors in the aftermath? And did you see any?
Right. Thanks for your question, Simran. I think I can answer the latter part of the question slightly simpler than the former part. In that, psychosocial support, in my estimation, is pretty limited. In most cases, it did not exist. It was a life of isolation, the social afterlife, which is one of the reasons, which was one of the motivations for the book. For instance, I can tell you in Choti Nirbhaya's case, they still live where they used to. They live in a shanty near railway tracks. They continue to live there. The parents were daily wage laborers, which they continue to be. They did tell me that the police were very kind. So in a lot of the, which I suppose is a saving grace. So in a lot of the child rape cases, they say that the police system were very kind to them. The magistrate would be wonderful. But where the lack exists is in the aftermath, several months on, several years on, when it has reached the court system. Unfortunately, there is a huge pendency That is the biggest problem that I believe plagues the judiciary at this point. There is a huge pendency. Judges are often transferred from one court to the other. So you might develop a rapport with a specific judge who's hearing your child's case, but then they're shifted out and somebody else comes in. So that kind of connection breaks. And in a lot of cases, like I mentioned, you might be told that your testimony is done. You don't need to come to further court hearings. We'll let you know what happens. So in a lot of that sense, they have no idea of the amount of time that's passing by and what is actually happening in their case. So even though it is their case, the agentive role is sort of almost wrested from them after a point. So I think what they're really looking for at this point is the ability to kind of resume that agentive role again and be able to know, where their case is at, how long it's going to take, just the sort of sense of empathy or ability for somebody in the system to reach out and tell them, hey, here's where we're at. It'll take a few more months, or it's looking like a conviction, or this is the testimony that's still waiting to be said, or you can't read a court document, let me get somebody to translate that for you. Or it doesn't exist in these sort of very coordinated systems. There will be one kind person, and obviously I like to believe that most of us, 99% of us perhaps want to do good, want to be good. So there'll be one kind person perhaps in a court system who will do that for you. But it is still very, very one-off, very agentive in terms of who takes that responsibility or onus on, but the system hasn't yet. So I think in terms of psychosocial support, a lot of it remains to be done in especially that period, when the case has sort of reached the court system, recognizing that, a lot of these people are still inhabiting that house or that space where it happened. A lot of them still have interface with the rapist's family who might be pressuring them. I think that's where the support is lacking. Thank you. Ankush, I believe you had a question that you were asking me
Yes,
also
yes,
about the court
yes,
system,
yes,
or
yes. So I think good we came to this question of support
yeah,
because I was asking you about this public prosecutor called Raj Kataria,
yeah,
and I found her position very intriguing because she's
yeah.
someone who's very much part of the system, and one would
Mm-hmm.
assume if you're part of the system, you have all the more sort of autonomy or institutional power to be able to intervene.
Yeah.
But we realize that she's also struggling. Just to give context to everyone, Raj Kataria is a public prosecutor in one of the cases, and we see her argue the case for Ranjini, no Meera, for the Meera's case. I think she
For Chutki and for Choti
Chutki
Nirbhaya.
for Choti, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
yeah,
Yeah.
the answering, and but we realize that it really affects her.
Yeah.
She there are passages which you mentioned how she says that she her colleagues tell her to काम नहीं कर पाएगी and नौकरी कैसे करेगी if it lets it affect you. So just to flow from what you said earlier
Yeah.
about this question of support being individualistic and agentive and not institutional.
Yeah.
Is it because can it be read like this, that because there is no or very less institutional support, that is why there is pressure on people like on Raj Kataria, who
Yeah.
are navigating and who are sort of overburdened or over responsibilized. Is that like, what would be your comments on that? Like
Yeah.
the over responsibilization of individuals when
Yeah.
there are systemic weaknesses.
Correct. I think I think that has sort of become the unfortunate truth in this matter, Ankush, that I find a lot,
Mm.
because I think there is inherently, of course, in India, as a post colony and with a lot of our hassles, there is a mistrust of the system already, right? Like
Mm.
one of the most common ways in which, even beyond the bounds of this book, when you talk to someone and you tell them, oh, the system is really corrupt, people will be like, oh, so what's new? We
Mm.
somehow almost know that there have to be ways that you depend on jugaad. All right, who do you know? How can we circumvent this? And of course, we have to do this. And so you just kind of take that in your stride. But where that sort of becomes a problem in cases like this, in these sort of stories, is because it asks a lot from the individual. So
Individually, yes.
Yeah, so in institutions like this, that's why I highlighted Raj Kataria, because when I met her, and one of the parts that I bring out in the book was I met her first when I was reporting Choti Nirbhaya story, which happened a few years before
Hmm.
Chutki, who's the 8-month-old baby, and she had been the public prosecutor for that case. And years later, when I was reporting Chutki's case, and I was going to courts a lot more, at that time I'd become a little more seasoned. I knew what court to go to, etc. I sat there and I met her again and I told her, oh, I didn't realize, you were part of the prosecution team for this case. And she was like, yes, I actively take them on because, she said she had a love for children. She had kids of her own and she just wanted to be a part of the story. But as I began to, then I asked her if I could follow her around, for the stories. She consented and I did that. And a lot of this she was a very interesting character. So our
Hmm.
conversations were always great, but a lot of what came out was this sense of responsibility she felt because she was like, I don't know what I could possibly do. There is a lot of pressure on me, but I take it home with me a lot. And in
Hmm.
fact, even now she's retired from the system. She retired a year ago. And even now when we speak, she says, I still go to sleep thinking about what happened in Chutki's case or what happened in Choti Nirbhaya's, because I'm not sure that is getting solved. I'm not sure where those threads get unraveled,
Hmm.
because I don't think you can kind of trust that something automatically moves from point A to point B to point C. So there
Hmm.
is somebody like Raj Kataria who has to step in. There is, in Chutki's case, usually in fast track cases or in
Hmm.
child rape cases, there will also be somebody that the government assigns to you, who is
Yeah.
usually some sort of, rights body. So they have a rights body that is assigned to them, and I often
Hmm.
speak to them as well to find out updates for Chutki when they ask me to. And so
Hmm.
he will always tell me, he sort of unleashes a lot of his frustrations at the system
Yeah.
in certain calls. And sometimes he'll be like, but I need to be professional. Let me tell you, da 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 da,
Hmm.
this is what is going on. But then, eventually those frustrations will come out where he's like, a judge keeps getting changed. This month I argue in front of someone, we are told, 3 months later, here's our date. I land up at that date, but the other party is not shown up, or suddenly we have a new judge, and that new judge has no idea about the details of the case. So we begin again. And so it kind of goes on from one place to the other. And there is an understanding that the system is overburdened, but the fact is, nobody's belling the cat. So nobody really knows who, when you talk about the system, it almost becomes like this hydra, like this 10-headed hydra, but you
Hmm.
don't know what the head then is. It's just different people at this point taking the onus.
True.
Yeah.
True. Very true. I think so. We have a question from Pooja,
Yeah.
who says, "Thank you for the presentation." She has two questions. Is
Yeah.
SA, I think SA means sexual assault, stroke
Yeah.
rape of a person from a LGBTQI community taken seriously by the system, or their orientation impacts how these cases are dealt with? Do they find support? And the
Mm.
second question is, do men sexual assault survivors get justice and support given our patriarchal setup? So very pertinent
Yeah.
questions. Your
Yeah, thanks, Pooja. I wish, I had the broad expertise to speak about these at detail. I don't think I do to the level that, I do of these cases that I've spoken of in the book, but I have encountered these, of course, when you report on sexual violence for a very long time. I have mostly reported on stories of women and children, uh, several from marginalized communities and now marital rape. But what I do know is that when a law doesn't already exist for you, it is much, much harder for you to be taken seriously. So in the case of, let's say the LGBTQ community, somebody who identifies as different from the cis heteronormative, system within which we understand sexual violence, it is a lot harder because I feel like we still don't have the level of sensitization or training at the police system because those laws don't exist for somebody to be like, what's your gender, what's your sex, and so your assailant was, and so you are. I mean, it literally comes down to these very raw sort of lack of vocabulary problems.
Hmm.
And with male sexual assault survivors as well, I think one of the problems that exists, a lot of male sexual assault survivors that I've spoken to were people who were children when this happened to them. And when they've tried to kind of speak out about it, as kids, of course, they were told that it doesn't happen. One of the problems is that the focus in rape reporting on India is on stranger rape. So you will see that the cases that get the most attention, Nirbhaya rightly got a lot of attention, but she was somebody who boarded a bus, was assaulted by five men she did not know. There was a lot of focus, of course, on voyeuristic articles, and then eventually we had a body. So the unfortunate crux of the matter becomes that sometimes in cases of rape or sexual violence in India, you almost need a body. You almost need these voyeuristic, sensational ideas or artifacts, for people to be told whether iron rods or, what objects were used, that the fact that you didn't know the person. So, of course, it's a monster in the streets. So that narrative gets a lot more precedence over the fact that it could be a wife being raped by a husband, a male child being raped by an uncle, somebody who identifies as trans being raped by somebody else. Those narratives, unfortunately, don't get that kind of precedence because we can't fit them into those neat boxes that we seem to hear a lot more. So I think what we need currently is just a lot more vocabulary, both legal vocabulary, social vocabulary. At least in marital rape, that's one of the challenges that I'm constantly finding, because when I speak to women who try to talk about that, they don't know how to describe their violence. They almost don't even call it rape. They begin with saying that I've been beaten, I was thrashed. Oh, and by the way, XYZ also happened, and I didn't really consent, but was it rape? So they don't know because it's not in that neat box. So I think for a lot of these assailants, at least for a lot of the male child assailants, child victims and survivors that I spoke to, that was one of the problems. They were not given that vocabulary, and they were like, this happened, but it just doesn't fit into that neat compartment. So I hope that answers some of that question for you.
So, oh yeah. So okay. So Pooja has just commented. One question which I had from you, and since you spoke about Nishu,
Yeah,
very curiously, can I read a small passage of your book and then I will ask you?
yeah, sure.
So it's from page 53, and it says, I was immensely interested. What did women talk about when they gathered? But it wasn't just women, Manju Didi pointed out. It was men too. A whole conglomerate of brothers, fathers, husbands, and friends who showed up in solidarity with survivors. I was later to meet a man called Kailash, who was on the ad hoc committee that Meera headed. Kailash's wife had been raped, and the man spent most of his days reaching out to other men who had wanted to evict their wives for suffering sexual assault. Kailash's story might not find a larger place in the following pages that are dedicated to women, but there have been few men whose words and actions have been so touched by. There is also you spoke of. There is another chapter. There is a male called Vishnu who figures. What if you could just tell a little more about your interaction with or conversations with men like Kailash and Vishnu,
Yeah,
and how is that different? What wires probably them differently? I know it's a complex question
yeah,
than somebody like Nishu. Uh,
yeah,
and because that is also my research area, so
right.
I'm very curious to
Yes,
know from you like some on-ground, perspectives,
yeah.
insights. And second part of this question is that what actual on-ground interventions can be had in
Mm.
case of people or boys like Nishu, so
Mm-hmm.
that these are it is a more preventive intervention
Yeah.
than a sort of punitive intervention. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
so if you could just probably, based on your experience on the field for so long,
Yeah.
shed light on these two.
Yeah, yeah. It's so vital, Ankush. And something that you said at the end reminded me of problems in a healthcare system. For instance, one of the
Hmm,
things when I was in the US for a short while, they
hmm,
complained of the healthcare system a lot. And that was because a lot of their system was, the aftermath and not so much preventative.
preventive. Yes.
Yeah, so you kind of see that a lot in a perhaps a different realm, but
Hmm,
in a lot of these cases when it happens in the aftermath, but prevention isn't taken at the right time, then you have cases like Nishu and the Rewari gang rape happening.
hmm,
But wherever I did encounter men like Kailash and Vishnu, it was absolutely poignant. It was incredible to see the kind of solidarity that they were able to proffer, and it made a huge difference.
Mm.
They were men who were allies in the true sense, in that they fronted the woman who'd perhaps faced sexual violence, and they were very, very proud of the women who were speaking up. So one
Mm.
of the stories that I speak of, Mira's case and in
Mm.
Ranjini's case, when the husbands you see offer them support, it makes a massive difference, because in both their cases, the accused gets acquitted. So
Mm.
that could very well turn around, in someone else's story, to the husband or the family turning around and being like, hey, you probably lied. I mean, the court acquitted him, so why should I believe you? And
Mm.
as a result, perhaps you should leave the home, you should leave the village. It happens in a lot of stories. They chose not to do that. And they kind of fronted the women a lot in the telling of their stories. They accompanied them everywhere that they wanted to. And I think it comes down to just your personal relationship and you kind of believing. When we say that, believe survivors' voices, sometimes when you hear something like that,
Mm.
it's a theory, right? It's an abstract idea, it's an abstraction. You spout a lots of these ideologies, but those ideologies become ground realities when you come down to these relationships, when it comes down to Vishnu supporting his wife or to Kailash supporting his wife. So that is where, believe survivors' voices comes in, when you listen to your wife telling you what happened to her. And
Mm.
in their cases, it became primarily important because both Kailash's wife, both Vishnu's wife, they were Dalit women, and they had been raped by people in the village who wielded a lot of social privilege, a lot of class power, caste power, who were also trying to oust them from the land that they owned. So it would
Mm.
have been very easy to kind of subtract the woman from the equation, right? And be like, all right, she's been raped. Let's remove her from the equation. I still get to kind of hold this land and we'll, sort that out. But there was a refusal to treat the survivor as spoils of a war. There was
Mm.
refusal to see somebody as less than human. And there was an insistence on kind of equating them as agentive individuals. So I think when that understanding existed in the men that I followed,
Mm.
prevention of cases like Nishu kind of were easier to do. I think
Mm.
in Nishu's case, in the Rewari case, one thing that was so prominent for me and a lesson that I really carry whenever I hear a story or like this is, and it's happened in a milieu, I now like to go about asking people, has this happened before? Have people tried to report this before? And have you been obstructed in some way? Because in many cases, they would want to kind of speak about it, but they didn't have the sort of solidarity that Kailash or Vishnu offered.
Mm.
So.
True, very true, very true. Thank you. There is, I think, yeah, there's a long comment from Ganesh Raghav who says these things mostly happen in the underprivileged backgrounds. There is no systematic support for the survivors too, and there is no legal protection against marital rapes. And the irony is, for many women, getting married, it is their goal or their dream from their childhood, and also it's kind of hyped as the biggest day. So, what could we expect from such a society? Getting education, financial freedom is one way out, but rethinking at least marital vows should be made right, made uh, not against the marriage system. Just the dowry system and moving of women into man's family instead of both moving. I'm not understanding the question here. So I'll just read out the comment. And justice also happens swiftly if the same thing happened for the upper caste by lower caste. And because of dowry, one suicide happened in Tamil Nadu quite recently, who also belong to very dominant caste. Can't avoid the caste system completely. So it doesn't matter wholly or entirely just about caste, where it might or might not come. So it's not a question really, it's a comment which is there. And yes. So, last probably question from me. How did you work on gaining the trust of the family members and survivors to open up and engage with you? For some of the families you have been in touch for so long. So, but how did you do it with them, and how, where did the sort of emotional stamina come from? Because that connect does not sort of come in a day. So how did you work on gaining the trust and also sort of you know balance the role of a reporter and an author and also like a human being and a woman who was sort of, speaking to them. So, do you want to talk about that a little, please? You're muted. Mute.
Yeah, sorry.
Yes.
I could attempt that, although it's hard to kind of really know where that shifted for me. But I can tell you that initially I had no emotional stamina for something like this. I cared. I cared about these stories. I have a story of my own that I've spoken about at length elsewhere.
Yes.
But I had personal motivations, but I also really, really cared about cases that kind of almost inhabited this gray realm. Uh, Stories which weren't stranger rape, like I said, which you couldn't so easily kind of box away and forget after months. So I cared and I began to report them, but initially I had no emotional stamina. So I would literally come home and be in tears and feel like I couldn't possibly go back and do this again. There was a time when Smita, when I first met her, I think in 2014 or 15, she was telling me her story and she wanted to, she was really brave. She was like, I want to tell you my story. Here it is. I want to say it on camera. And of course, you had rules, you silhouetted faces, you pseudonymized, etc. But she was there. She wanted to tell it. And in the middle of telling the story, I got so overwhelmed that I shut the camera and I just ran to hug her. Because sometimes that kind of, and that's just a personal moment, from 10 years ago, but I just didn't know otherwise. At the time, I was like, this is my honest reaction. This is just how I feel. I feel like I can't hear it. And what do I do with this? Like, what power do I even have to change even a slight, sort of anything really on this trajectory? So I think where that began to change for me was when I did more and more follow-ups. When I began to know them more and more, I realized that that stamina sort of got subsumed by my personal rapport with someone, and that I needed to, yeah, I needed to be able to create a bridge between who I was when I was reporting the story and who I was at home, and that needed to happen. So now I feel like, the hard truth of it is, even though I care just as much, if not more, and perhaps know a lot more through research and, reporting for all these years, I am able to, for the case, actually create a kind of boundary in my mind where I'm like, if I need to give 100% of myself to this story, not break down, tell their story as best as possible, then I'll need to kind of safeguard this space where I don't break down, where I don't cry, where I don't get overwhelmed. And that has come about generally through this friendship. So I think perhaps for reasons best known to them, they've seen that. So over years of just showing up to not just, court hearings, but also to birthday parties. I try not to miss a single one of Chutki's birthdays, from the time she was 8 months old and it happened to her to now, her birthday is a month and a half away. So I'm always there. We speak a lot, and that happens for a lot of the other stories as well. So I think that has just kind of intrinsically happened now, where yeah, I guess the short answer of it is I do the best I can, but um, you know,
Oh, thank you so much. We have I think a couple of more questions. We can just take these and we can move towards closing, if that's okay. Sayani uh, says, how did the book impact the coming
Mhm.
forward of other survivors post publication, and how did readers approach you if they had experiences to share? Uh,
Yeah,
and Kay's question, we can combine the two. For people who come from more privileged backgrounds, what all do you think we can do to try to make a difference? So
sure.
I just repeat, how did the book impact the coming forward of other survivors post publication, and how did readers approach you if they had
Yeah,
experiences, and how do others, including privileged people from privileged backgrounds, can
right,
make a difference?
right. Yeah, thanks, Shiny, and thanks. Is it Aika?
Aika or KEI?
Right. Thank you both for your questions. I think Shiny, the book certainly did actually cause a lot of people to reach out to me, mostly through DMs, on social media. I have profiles on most of the outlets essentially. And so I did get a lot of, I still do get a lot of DMs on people who want to share their story, and sometimes they let me know that they just want to share, and that's fine. I always want to listen, and sometimes I get a friend out of it, and some of them become bigger than that, where they'll tell me that they'd like it reported journalistically, and then I take it forward from there. But in cases like this, it is just like I saw in Nishu's case, it is sort of a snowball effect. It happened with me too, wherever, when we were, no pun intended, when the Me Too movement was happening as well. Over those 2 years, you saw that quite actively in a more public facing way, where, someone spoke up and then more women spoke up, perhaps under the guise of anonymity, but you had that sort of power and solidarity where you were like, I'm not the only one. So people aren't just going to be looking at me or asking me questions. I'm part of a larger tribe or a group of women or a group of, survivors who are doing this together. So I think it makes a difference. I do believe that the prime reason for doing work like this is that it does make a difference to others. Like when I speak to Smita nowadays, she's always so proud of the book, or her story being out there, because she tells me, I'm so glad somebody else might not be going through this, or I'm so glad that if I tell her, someone reached out to me. She always is shoved by the fact that there's someone else who could be sharing that. So that certainly happens. Aika, to your question, I think, yes, as people from more privileged backgrounds, the idea is to witness and to listen, slightly more academic terms perhaps, but um, to basically listen with as much empathy as possible and see what's not being told. Often, the stories that we're being told are also being told by people, obviously, with more privilege, because you just have more access, but then see what's not being told and try to kind of front that. Something that a lot of the, NGOs or the rights groups that I work with, who work with a lot of people from marginalized backgrounds, they'll tell me that that the reason that a lot of stories we hear come from underprivileged backgrounds is because sometimes they just believe they don't have the choice. If they don't have access to the justice system or the police, or they're going to be coerced, then they feel like, let me at least speak up. Let me use this voice, because everybody already knows I live in a very intimate geography where, I can't change my geography. I don't have the money to up and move. Everyone knows. So why not then at least speak up? So it almost comes from a sense of, this is the only tool that I have. Whereas I've often noticed with people from more privileged backgrounds, when abuse happens, there is a tendency or an ability to be able to shush that or to repress that far more. And that resilience perhaps isn't able to see that light of day because just stigma works differently. And so you want to protect your position of power. So I think with my marital rape research, I'm trying as best as I can to break that, because with at least domestic violence, that's something that happens almost, sad as this sounds, it almost traverses barriers, caste, class, what have you. And so a lot of people who face this behind doors just have the same problem. So I think that's one of the ways that I've been trying to make a difference. And was there another question, Ankush, that I've missed?
Yes, yes. Actually, there are two more.
Okay.
If we can. Aditi, it's a long comment, and then there's a question. Thanks for the dialogue today. I'm trying to understand a recurring pattern here in the case of sexual abuse and violence that happens within families, where the survivor is raped by their own family members, and upon sharing they're invalidated, rejected, denied, and mostly gaslighted into forgetting it ever happened. They are often forced to share the same geographical spaces with their abuser for years and probably for the rest of their lives, where they witness people meant to protect them openly supporting the abuser. This erasure of rape is pretty common in survivor narratives where rape happens within families. There is also the role that religion plays into it, whether through the concept of karma, forgiveness, or penance, in other forms that abusers might be said to have performed, like illness or loss of some sorts. Through your experience and exposure, I want to know if you can situate the role of religion within the occurrence and aftermath of this violence. Thank you.
Hmm.
So,
Okay, it's a deep question. Sorry, I missed the question. Aditi?
Aditi.
Yeah. It's a pretty deep question, Aditi, and I think you certainly have something there. It would be very interesting if this is something that you want to write about at some point, I'm going to be all ears, because it is very important. And I do believe things like religion, ideas of honor culture, honor norms, culture norms do play a large part. So, for instance, in Chutki's case, when I was reporting it, one of the things that was said all the time was that, Suraj, which was the name of the cousin who raped the baby, it was constantly said that, oh, he was under the influence of alcohol. Otherwise, he would never have done this. So this, it was constantly fronted. And the other justification that was possibly said was this only happened because the mother wasn't at home. Why did she even leave the baby at home? The father was asked no questions. But under the very strict sort of honor norms that kind of govern their specific, home unit, the idea was the father had gone to work. Why did the mother also have to go to work? She wasn't at home. She left her baby with relatives, and therefore it was her fault. And to this day, actually, this isn't something that I've said before, but to this day, she has not gone back to work. She used to work in people's homes. She was a domestic help. She used to teach people. She just stopped completely and never wanted to go back. When I ask her, she says that perhaps I will when justice prevails in whatever way there could be. So I think, that is one aspect of course, honor culture, which is also intrinsically tied with religion, with culture, what have you. And I saw that a lot also in a lot of the affluent families who I spoke to. So in that, the sense of forgiveness operated at a large extent. In the marital rape stories that I'm currently researching and writing on, uh, a lot of the survivors met their abusers at places that they inhabited because they were from a specific religion. So you just sort of had these milieus that you already inhabited, and as a result, there is that pressure kind of is exerted on you when you want to report, because sometimes your support system is also part of that religion or that culture. And so people are able to kind of collectively tell you that, don't do this, or, they're a part of this group, and as a result, you'll be isolated. So in Meera and Ranjini's case, for instance, Meera is raped by the village pandit. And so, of course, huge role of, sort of how religion is looked at in their village, where she was a Dalit woman. She was sharing a wall with someone who was dominant caste. And so when the Pandit, when this dominant caste person sort of raped her, he wasn't blamed because obviously he was at an exalted position. So you do see that a lot. I would have to kind of look at how deeply that cycle kind of perpetuates to where forgiveness comes in, where karmic cycles come in. I know that that is, a large part of dharmic understandings of, things like that. But if you ever do that, Aditi, let me tell you, I would be all eyes and ears. And perhaps if you're not, I'll kind of look at that at some point. But at this point, what I can tell you is that these are the avenues in which I have seen that, in which I've seen sort of honor culture work, at least in a lot of these levels. And was there another question, Ankush?
Yes, yes. Thank you. I think Kay is saying thank you for the answers. Wish there was more that can be done for survivors and people who don't have a way out. Mandakini, again, one of our my colleagues at Usava, she's asking, I'm of Indian origin but live in Vienna, Austria. I'm often asked by Europeans after news reports of sexual assault how Indians learn about sex and consent. I don't have an answer so far. Are there public resources raising awareness, education, or
Yeah.
NGOs working in this area?
Yeah. I could answer that shortly, Mandakini, in succinctly, by telling you that yes, there are. We certainly have, something that I've noticed that is not, there is no dearth of in India, is that people are trying. There are multiple NGOs, public rights groups and resources that are being expended on that. Whenever I report, I try to kind of find out who's working in that realm in whatever city or village I'm in. And usually there is at least one who's trying to work with the people in the community. They're the ones who usually do the best work because they know the village or they know the community, and they do the best they can. But there is, of course, a dearth of funds. There is often, you don't know how it's going to expand from there. But they do try. With marital rape, for instance, one of the things that some of the NGOs who can't even call themselves marital rape NGOs, right? Because we simply don't have that term or that vocabulary. But something they are trying to do when they speak to survivors is to educate them about that, or to tell them that there is vocabulary that you could use. So I think when there isn't legal nomenclature, when something doesn't exist in sort of these stamped legalistic terms, that's where NGOs and groups like these kind of come in, because they try to create that. So I have been a part of that. It's just that it's not a coordinated system yet, because obviously you have to work in cahoots with your local government or with the judiciary, and so things can be at a disarray. So it just needs to be better.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Urmi. Thank you, Mandakini. I think we have done with the questions. I think there'll be. I had again curiously. I keep going back to Vishnu Kailash. So, is it true that supportive practices from men come from men who are from non-dominant castes? Do you see like those kind of patterns happening where caste plays a role in whether men would want to come in supportive roles or not,
Right.
or so does caste and probably even class play a role there, according to whatever you have seen?
Right, right. I think, in the stories that I reported, Ankush, it certainly seemed that way, because they were stories of caste violence that had been enacted on the
Hmm.
woman's body. So, in
Hmm.
that sense, often there had been a sense of this pattern of violence continuing for a long time, and the man was almost an equal part of being subjected to the violence before the rape happens. So, there is an understanding that our position has remained the same, nothing has changed, and now this egregious form of violence has been enacted on the person's body, on my partner's body, and we can together front this resistance or this battle. So one of the reasons that those stories were so powerful to me were because they were like, the rape was enacted because there is a need to kind of wrest land or wrest some sort of social control from us. And like I said, like a lot of the NGOs keep talking about, that the reason that those voices are raised are because it's unfortunately the only tool they sometimes have. So
Yeah.
when I sometimes go to report a story, I know that a lot of people from marginalized backgrounds or who don't come from as much social capital as someone else will speak up, because they're like, India still has, it's perhaps it's waning now, there are lots of challenges, but our fourth pillar of democracy is very important, because people are like, this will be on TV, right, Didi, or this will be somewhere, like someone will be able to see this, right, someone will be able to read this. So I think the idea that something's out there, even if not through the first three pillars, even if it's not through the executive or the judiciary, they believe that, if the media covers this, or if the story is out there, then perhaps we'll be able to tell our story. So I think that, unfortunately, sometimes that resistance happens because there is no other form of resistance.
True. True. Very true.
Yeah. And
Thanks,
I agree,
Smita.
Mandakini. The where was the mother comment is a very important one. And it comes out a lot. Like no matter who is the subject of the violence, I think we always wonder, did the mother just not raise the child well enough? Or if they've been raped, where was the mother? Why wasn't she
Hmm.
around?
So, Kay here, he or she, I'm not sure, says that a personal answer here. She was talking about I think, the discussion about the education about consent.
Yeah.
Said a personal answer but in my school, there was basically no sex ed given apart from our science books explaining how sex happens, but
Right.
nothing about safe sex and with consent and assault. We are taught about it once, but there is no like conversation about it afterwards. I'm sure in more metropolitan cities there is more sex ed, but a lot of smaller cities and smaller places are, I think, forgotten a bit.
Yeah. I completely agree with
So I
you,
think,
Kay. I grew up in a metropolitan city, and I didn't really have any sex ed. I mean, I was from the time where, one had a biology class where one was discussing genitals and people were giggling. I mean, that was the level that one was operating at. So NGOs are trying at this point, but like I said, it does need to be a far more coordinated sort of effort, right? Like it'll have to have government money behind it, where a government says that, hey, sex education needs to be coordinatedly or strategically sort of dispersed across schools, across communities in this way. And that's how we can normalize it. But it's not normalized, as a result of which gender segregation exists. As a result of which, a lot of things, kind of amount to, egregious acts like nishus being performed, where people are
Hmm.
emboldened.
True, true.
Yeah.
Simran says yes, and the consequence of that, the mother carries the guilt of letting this happen and blaming herself for it. My mother went through that a lot.
Yeah.
Um, and I think Kay says, yeah, people giggling in my class too, hoping people start realizing how important sex ed is.
Yeah.
Mandakini says, this is a little off topic, but what about women's pleasure and arousal? Are those also topics? I think Mandakini can probably
Yeah.
elaborate. So, I think. Uh, so I
Yeah.
think
Hi,
we
everyone.
covered.
Sorry, I'm just saying,
Yes.
Ankush, women's
Yes.
pleasure and arousal is actually quite a taboo, I think, and it's also a way, in my opinion, my humble opinion.
Hmm.
I'm a bit older than at least I think Urmi and Ankush, and I think that it's late. It's when you look back at your life in retrospect and you realize like you have a big case history of friends, family, people, and I think that men's desire and arousal is always like taken to the forefront of things,
Mm-hmm.
right? So there's like a drive, and what in this case, it's of course nothing to do with sexuality. It's actually violence, right? And when we're talking about sexual assault or abuse, but I think women's arousal and pleasure is something that is so ephemeral in our discussions that we don't actually know what it's like to enjoy sex or to have a kind of nuanced experience of pleasure or warmth, and how that is to be sort of, let's say, experienced in a consensual relationship. There's a lot of performance, and I think performance happens also for males. There's a lot of fear behind it also, right? And I think I've heard this in many sort of colloquial expressions, like if if a man is not brave or something, this is too ladki hai, that kind of thing. So the woman is always like a passive thing, and or is required to be passive. And I think there's a lot of fear behind the voracity of a woman, or an experienced woman, or a woman who demands her pleasure. And this is something I just wanted to add to this discussion as something empowering. And yeah, just a little footnote. And thank
Yeah.
you for your
Perhaps.
work, Urmi.
Thank you, Mandakini, for sharing. Perhaps a different discussion, but an equally important one. So thank you for sharing your own experience. Okay. Um, yeah. Thank you for being a part of this, all of you. And over to you, Ankush and Smita, if
Yes.
we had any concluding words.
Yes. 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 I have concluding words. I think Smita wanted to ask a question. She had messaged
Mhm.
me some time back. We were waiting to come to the end, and I think so. Smita, if you're there, uh,
Yes, I am here. Very
yeah,
much
yeah,
here.
yes,
Um, no, so Urmi, one is that, like you mentioned, that there is sex education. There
Mhm.
are all these NGOs doing their work. There are journalists like you doing their work. How is the social structure? How is the cultural structure failing women, rape survivors of all genders, um, rape survivors of, non-dominant castes? How I don't think that it's just a question of um, education or policy or, you know, where are we fundamentally going wrong? I feel that we have a lot of questions to answer in the cultural space. I wanted to ask you about that.
Yeah, I think Smita, it all happens in tandem, right? All of these are important questions to ask. All of these are conversations that need to happen together. But I think that that's what's not happening, where you have legal access sort of being prevented for people, where you also don't have sex education reaching people, and therefore, gender segregation kind of existing. Then you also have cases where, women's sexual pleasure is also weaponized and sort of bodies being used against them. So, you see that, for instance, in Smita's case, you see that in a lot of cases where when women do want to report rape and it's not a stranger, then there are questions of, well, then how did you know the man? And of course, when it's marital rape, the idea is a husband couldn't probably rape. So I think there are a lot of cultural questions, a lot of honor norm questions that need to be dismantled, which need to happen in a coordinated fashion. So what often happens is at one level you could have sex education, but you don't have a lot of the other tools at your disposal, or in some cases, you don't have access to, like you see in Pia's case or in Nidhi's case, you don't have access to knowing how your court case is possibly progressing, and therefore you don't know how the afterlife for you looks like. So I think in a lot of these things, they just need to happen together. They're not. And I think my goal, at least with the book, was to show what we could focus on, therefore, because these weren't cases that were voyeuristic, these weren't cases like that had received any sort of, very, very voracious media attention because there had been a body or because they'd been killed. Sometimes, unfortunately, we give a lot of attention to rape because there's been, a death. It's resulted in a death, so people are galvanized, they come to the streets. But what happens when it doesn't happen? When do we kind of begin to sort of change that conversation around? So I think we do need to understand it differently. Of course, we still have, like I mentioned at the beginning, we still have stock images of, tear bedimmed eyes and, women sort of almost feeling the shock of rape. Rape is equated to death. In a lot of cases, we still don't use rape survivors' names, of course, and there are lots of, social repercussions, which is why we don't. But a lot of, NGOs or survivors I speak to would like to sometimes see that as a possibility in the future, where one is able to do that without feeling that one would be stigmatized.
Yeah. No,
So,
and that also sort of ties into Mandakini's question, right? I mean,
yeah.
the whole culture is against sex as pleasure, but
Mm-hmm.
sex as power, sex as a weapon, right? And yes, the caste thing, the caste question that Ankush also asked, that I think um, Ganesh has asked, right? The question of caste. You know, I think it's also important, and I'm very happy that we have Ankush and Ganesh participating in today's lecture. Ankush, in fact, helming this lecture, because I feel that, the more you're privileged, the more you're, in the power structure, the higher up you are, the more privileged you are. It's important for them to sort of empathize with everybody else who are below them. Like you said that, these people, these men who were supporting their wives, there were people who were from these non-dominant castes, and they were used to that kind of violence. So in that case, it was less gender violence, more systematized caste violence, right? So yeah, so I think, yeah, that's something that I observed. That's not a question. It just came out of this discussion. So that's all from my end. Ankush, I will hand the baton back to you, and please carry on.
Yes,
Urmi, as and when you feel you're ready to close, please just let us know. I
yes,
mean, we can continue. I can't
yeah,
stop talking to you. I can't stop listening to you. I can't
yeah.
stop listening to all the questions that are coming up. Uh,
Yeah, same. I think incredible comments, incredible questions. I'm so glad everybody's kind of pouring forth in the chat box. I also want to let
Mm,
everyone know, feel free to DM me on Instagram or email me, if
mm.
there's anything else you want to talk about, even beyond this. But I'm really glad that we've all been a part of this today. That's just my sort of ending salvo.
Yes. So I think Ganesh said, yeah, that's what I wanted to ask in my long comment with so many words. I think that was in response to Smita's question. I've got many people have DM'd saying, Bhavna has said, wow, this is really insightful and so glad to join this. The main problem is, I think period, sex, sexuality are all taboo subjects. And since they shy away from speaking these words in most families at home, they tend not to believe assaults. So thank you for this. Looking forward to more like this. Before this, Pooja Ayush says, thank you so much for the study circle. Empathy, understanding, solidarity are key. Pooja says, thank you. Simran has said, thank you so much for the insightful conversation. We, Ankush, hope you continue the study circles. And yes, so uh, so I will just to sort of tie up everything together, I will just uh, go through all the points which I have made. And this is just things which we can just, keep with us from here, the sort of point-wise takeaways. I think one of the things which started with is, Urmi spoke about the escalation ladder, where how it is always a chain or pattern which sort of is not checked and which is sort of, leads to something which is very heinous. When she talk about Nishu's case, then when she talk about space as a microcosm and the inability to forget, because a lot of times the perpetrator and the victim are inhabiting the same space, which is again, socioeconomic class and privilege become very important mediators of how the aftermath of rape plays out. She also spoke about social exile and this the Smita story, again the classic case of social and emotional abjection which is faced by victims. Again, in regarding her own journey, we were very privileged to hear from Urmi how she spoke about how she traversed the boundaries between reporting, documentation, also listening and witnessing, and also slowly transmuting to the role of rapport building and friendship, and also a role of a confidant, and how she looked beyond her role as a journalist to sort of look at it more sort of holistically. So that was very moving to hear the kind of work that you did and how it sort of personally kept you involved, and also the emotional probably toll that it took on you, and despite that how you continue to sort of do this. I think some of the highlights became very germane was the limited psychosocial support which is given. And so, and I'll quote, she said that the social afterlife of sexual assault is that of isolation. And that is probably because what we spoke about, that lack exists in the system, because of which a good or support is not the norm, but it is a very individualistic and a agentive kind of a intervention rather than a systemic or an institutional intervention. And that is something which is something that we should recognize and take away from here. Uh, Also, the one of the things which became important was to look at the lack of vocabulary when it comes to two kinds of assaults. One is, assault, sexual assault on LGBTQ and male sexual assault, and also on sexual assaults which are not stranger driven assaults, which are familial assaults, or which are within very close home, or marital rape, so to say. So the need to have more socio-legal vocabulary, both social and legal, becomes very important that we looked at it. We also looked at the importance of support and allyship, which is based on empathy, non-judgment, and respectfully recognizing victims' voices, compared to looking at seeing them as spoils of war, or as bodies, which happens. So we had a lot of conversation around that, and we covered that territory. Then we also looked at how the family, close relationships, religion, caste, class, they all intersect in a very complex manner to shape and also dilute the question of blame and appropriate responsibility, which underlines the sort of problematics of the opposite of stranger rape, so to say. Also, Urmi brought out how there are multiple NGOs, public rights groups, which are trying to educate people about sex and consent, but still there are shortcomings because of financial limitations, because of funding, and so on. We also had a very interesting understanding discussion where there is this problematic relation between honor norms, cultural norms, and imperfect sex education, so to say. So all three things together probably mediate, and why there are people, boys like Nishu that we come across. And elaborating on this, we talked about how culture positions sex not as pleasure but as power. And that's a whole lot of complex concepts which we sort of traversed within that. And thank you, everyone. Thank you to Urmi firstly for being a part of this, giving her your time and effort, for coming and sharing your journey with us, your work with us, and also provoking a lot of thought about something which is an immensely important thing to speak about and understand and know. And to thank you to all, to Smita for coming together and conceptualizing this space. We will have many more conversations like this. We will have many more discussions with this, and hopefully there'll be much more awareness and advocacy for a more gender just world subsequently. And lastly, thank you to all our participants. I think you've been a wonderful lot. When the session was starting, I was very scared when we were in single digits, but we went up, and then not only that, but there were also very very engaging questions and comments. And I'm just so hopeful, glad that we could do this, and we will continue to do this. The links which are there to Urmi's book, to the various other things that we discussed, is there on the slide. We will see what we can do about this recording. Subsequently, we will put it, share it online, or either on our page or on YouTube, and we will see how we will go about that. And that will be shared with all registered participants. So with that, I think we can, with Smita and Urmi's permission, we can close the session.
Of course.
Yes.
Urmi, thank you very much. Ankush, thank you very much. Just like yesterday, we were talking about, the place where masculinity is, the place where cis heteronormative practices are, the place where we pretend that we are a casteless society or a raceless society. I think all of these things need to come together. And first, I'm deeply grateful to Urmi for writing the book, for being here, and for everybody who came here, because everyone has come here with a lot of, they've come here with their presence, they have asked questions, they've made comments. Um, they want the system to change. So I think on that note of hoping for a day where such discussions become meaningless, where such discussions become a thing of the past, with that prayer, with that wish, um, let us bring this to a conclusion. And yes, we will be having more such discussions. If Urmi is ready, we will invite her again. We will share the
Absolutely.
information. Everybody who has registered, if you've not registered, just register. There's a registration link. So we will send out, the links, some material, some information to all of you, because this is not a conversation that can start and end in a single lecture. This is a conversation that needs to go on, and each one of us needs to take it forward. Thank you. Have a great weekend. And yeah, we'll see you soon again. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Urmi. Thank you, Smita. Thank you, everyone.